Hello, my good friends. Today I want to make a departure from the norm. The classical drosho that rabbis will give before Tisha B'Av is to talk about the terrible crime of sinas chinam, of idol hatred. The Gemara says that the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam. And the Gemara also says that any generation during which the Beis Hamikdash is not rebuilt, it's as if it was destroyed in that generation. Why is that? Because if we were not for the fact that we were still practicing sinas chinam, the Beis Hamikdash would return to its original glory. The fact that it does not is because we're still practicing sinas chinam, so we're guilty of causing the Beis Hamikdash to remain in a state of churban. So the rabbis will talk about, look how terrible it is that we have sinas chinam, we don't have the Beis Hamikdash because of our sinas chinam, and we must do something to correct that very serious crime. But I want to talk about just the opposite. I want to talk about how well we are doing in terms of controlling sinas chinam, the amazing work of Klal Yisrael in overcoming sinas chinam. And I want to do that because I have here a sefer Pella Yoetz, written by Rabbi Lazar Papo. He lived approximately 250 years ago. And he writes in the Pella Yoetz that when there's a pandemic, a magefa, that's not the time to criticize people and to give droshes and say, oh, the people, they did this avera and that avera. Because all that does is it creates ill will. It creates a negative impression in the eyes of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Rather, at a time of magefa, it's the time to be melamed zchus. It's to speak about the greatness of the Jewish people, the beauty of their lifestyle, so they should find favor in the eyes of Kadosh Baruch Hu, and hopefully he will bring an end to the pandemic. So today, I'm not going to talk about how bad sinas chinam is in the Jewish community. I'm going to talk about how well the Jewish community is doing in controlling sinas chinam. And I want to put it into the following framework. The Gemara says in Yuma that the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of three cardinal sins: Gilui Arayos, Shfichus Damim, Avodah Zarah, the immorality, murder, and idolatry. So the Gemara says that the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam. So the Gemara asks, which sin or set of sins was worse, the sins of the first Beis Hamikdash or the sin of sinas chinam of the second Beis Hamikdash? So the Gemara says the second Beis Hamikdash was far worse, and I'll prove it to you, because the first Beis Hamikdash was rebuilt after 70 years, whereas the second Beis Hamikdash, till this very day, it's still in a state of destruction, of churban. So you see that the sin of the second Beis Hamikdash far exceeded the sin of the first Beis Hamikdash. So I have two questions to ask. Number one, how could it be that the sin of the second Beis Hamikdash was greater than the sin of the first Beis Hamikdash? If there was sinas chinam in the second Beis Hamikdash, there had to be sinas chinam in the first Beis Hamikdash, because in the first Beis Hamikdash, murder was rampant, and people did not run around shooting, killing, and murdering their best friends. People murder those that they hate. People murder their enemies. So obviously there had to be sinas chinam. So how could the Gemara say that the sin of the second temple was worse than the first temple? The first temple, in addition to committing murder, there had to be sinas chinam. Secondly, in the first temple, the sinas chinam came to fruition. They hated people, and then they took out a gun and they shot them. In the second temple, the Gemara says they were oskim b'Torah u'mitzvos u'gemilas chasadim. On the outside, superficially, externally, it appeared as if they were great tzaddikim. They were doing everything right. They studied Torah, they learned daf yomi at night, they did tons of mitzvos, and they even did gemilas chasadim. So they were kind to everybody. They were supporting chesed organizations and institutions, Bikur Cholim and Tomchei Shabbos and things of that sort. But nonetheless, they had sinas chinam. So that means in the second Beis Hamikdash, the sinas chinam was hidden in their hearts, but there was no manifestation of it in their behavior. In the first Beis Hamikdash, not only did they have sinas chinam in their hearts, but it manifested itself in their conduct. the murders that they committed. So if sinas chinam is bad, even when it does not come to fruition, then how much more so is sinas chinam terrible if the person acts on those impulses and commits murder? So how could you say that the first Beis Hamikdash, the sin was of a lesser order than the second Beis Hamikdash? The first Beis Hamikdash, they had to have sinas chinam, and the sinas chinam came to fruition. That it wasn't just hypothetical; it was in practice. The potential became the reality, and they committed murder. Isn't that far worse than feeling thoughts of sinas chinam in your heart? That's my question. So I think the answer is as follows: that it is true that in the first Beis Hamikdash, not only did they commit murder, but they also had sinas chinam. However, there's a difference between the sinas chinam in the first Beis Hamikdash and the sinas chinam in the second Beis Hamikdash, and that's why the Gemara does not mention the sinas chinam in the first Beis Hamikdash. In the first Beis Hamikdash, the sinas chinam was transparent. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't under a blanket. They didn't pretend that they loved everybody. They demonstrated by their behavior that they hated people and they were going to knock them off and bump them off, and they joined the mafia in order to go around shooting people. So it was obvious that they had sinas chinam. They weren't pretending that they loved everybody. It was out in the open. There was transparency. In the second Beis Hamikdash, they were very religious people. They were doing all the mitzvahs. They were coming at night to learn in the shul, and they learned Daf Yomi for 3 hours every evening. And they gave a ton of money to tzedakah. Not only did they give 10%, they gave 20% of the money to tzedakah. And they had all sorts of tzedakah organizations. So you would think that these are people who are extremely righteous, big tzaddikim and chasidim. But in their heart, there was corruption. In their hearts, there was decay. There was sinas chinam. But it was sinas chinam that nobody knew about, because externally they were doing gemilas chasadim. They were doing acts of kindness. So those people in the Bayis Sheni, they were fraudulent people. They practiced righteous behavior, but in reality they were corrupt to the core. So that is far worse. Pretending to be a tzaddik and actually harboring sinas chinam in your heart is far worse than a person who is transparent. Because when there's transparency, there's hope for the person. The person might decide to do tshuva, a person might realize that his ways are not proper and appropriate. But when it's hidden in the heart, and a person conducts himself as if he's a super tzaddik, a tremendous chassid, but in deep within the recesses of his heart, unknown and unbeknownst to others, there's sinas chinam lingering. That sinas chinam is far more insidious, because it's something that a person is hiding, and therefore the person is living a life of fraud. He's a life of deception, and he's putting on a show as if he's a great tzaddik, but really he's a rasha, because he has sinas chinam in his heart, and he harbors it, and he thinks about it all the time in the privacy of his home. And therefore, the sin of the second Beis Hamikdash was far worse than the sin of the first Beis Hamikdash, because the first Beis Hamikdash, it was out in the open. In the second Beis Hamikdash, there was no transparency. Our society is, the sin of sinas chinam is so enormous in our society, because there's so much hatred exploding within different factions in America and around the world. I never remember a time when there was so much antagonism, so much derision, so much disrespect, so much lack of civility as there is today in the political world, and in the world of Hollywood and entertainment and in the media. Everybody is busy knocking the other person and treating them with disdain and hatred. There's so much hatred and anger, chaos in the society. I never saw anything like it. And each side feels tremendous righteous indignation because they believe that they are the tzaddikim. They are the great saviors of society. They are the great moral people. And it's the other guy that's the Rasha, the terrible villain. And therefore they're doing a great mitzvah in attacking those Rishayim. And that's why there's no tolerance in our society. And people refuse to hear what the other party says because they're setting it up in such a way as if there's nothing to talk about. Why do I have to hear what you have to say? You're terrible. I don't know, I was going to say the word trash. I don't like to use real negative words, but that's what they're saying. That you're a nobody. You're worthless. So why do I have to hear what you have to say? And that's what the other party says the same thing. There's so much intolerance in our society, and it's because there's so much anger and there's so much hatred, and the people are frauds because they're pretending to be Greis Tzadikim, great people, but really they're corrupt to the core. So the fact is that when we live in a society such a and I in all my years of my life, it's never been as bad as it is today, and it keeps on escalating. It keeps on, and you know all the examples. I could give you thousands of examples of things that people say that are just outrageous, and there's just no civility and discourse in our society. And on top of that, there's rioting in the last few months. There's rioting, and there's looting, and there's aggressive behavior, and belligerency, and vandalism, and terrorism. That's the kind of society we're living in today. It's unbelievable. So a person typically is influenced by the society in which he lives. So I would like to point out, and I'm saying this, God knows everything. He doesn't need me to remind him. But in the tradition of being Melamed Schus, of speaking about the greatness of the Jewish people, I want to say, I was going to say publicly, to whatever extent talking on a video is public, but I want to say, in public, that the Jewish people, when it comes to this area of sinas chinam, they are doing an unbelievable job of controlling negative feelings and negative impulses. There's such a focus since the time of the Chafetz Chaim. The focus on Lashon Hara is just unbelievable. There's so many hundreds of groups of people learning about the laws of Lashon Hara. And there's so many people that are attempting to be careful. And we talk about the Rabbanim, they talk about it in the shuls all the time. And it has an effect. And people are careful. And people know you're not supposed to speak Lashon Hara. And if they have a lapse, so they recognize that, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And the amount of chesed that people are doing, the concern and the care for the other people. And in our society, there is dialogue, and there is respect, and there's enormous emphasis on treating people with kavod that they deserve, and not allowing people to feel that they're not important. And I talk about all the time how important it is to greet people when they come to shul, to make them feel, if they're visitors or they're guests or they're an outsider, to make them feel important. And people do that all the time. I keep on getting reports about how special it is that people, they walk into the shul and they're greeted by the people in the shul. It's amazing. So as a tzibur, Klal Yisrael is doing terrific. And the reason why it's so magnificent is because if they would be doing it in a time when society was neutral, that would also be great. But to do it in an environment which is so charged with negativity and hostility and hatred and animosity, and to go completely against the grain and against the stream of the times in which we live, and to live lives of sensitivity, of treating people with kavod. I mean, Lashon Hara, the society today is like 10 billion light years away from Lashon Hara. Everything is Lashon Hara. The media is non-stop Lashon Hara. It's really not only Lashon Hara, it's Motzi Shema when you say something that's not true. And there's just attacks on all sides. Everybody's busy attacking each other. Lashon Hara is like the furthest things from their mind. And here as Jews, we're so careful not to say a single word. And the person doesn't even know about it. It's behind the person's back, so you say that the person, you make fun of him or something. It's Lashon Hara, you don't talk that way. That's the greatness of Klal Yisrael. And we all have to be proud of Klal Yisrael, of the Mi K'amcha Yisrael, who is like the Jewish people, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. And the Ribono Shalom, I'm sure, is proud of Klal Yisrael, that in times like this, where there's so much negativity and hatred in the society, and the fabric of our society is being torn asunder and apart by people who are violent and terrorists and full of anger and hatred, and Klal Yisrael is going to the opposite extreme, that reflects the enormous greatness of Klal Yisrael. And the Mir Hashem, in the schus of all the chesed and all the sensitivity and all the shmiras halashon classes that people go to, and all the care and the concern that we have for other people, and all the welcoming people when they come into shul, and trying to find ways to build people up instead of knocking them down. In that schus, in Mir Hashem, the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt, the Mashiach should come, b'mehera b'yameinu, amen.